On the morning of August 8th, 1973, a 17-year-old boy called the police and told them he had just shot a man dead. The dispatcher who took the call assumed it was a domestic situation, a fight that went wrong, a teenager in over his head with something that started as an argument and ended with a body on the floor. These things happened in Pasadena, Texas. They were handled. They moved through the system in the way that violent things do, filed, processed, resolved. What the dispatcher did not know was that the man on the floor was not a victim in any straightforward sense, that the house the boy was calling from contained a wooden board with restraints bolted to it at the wrists and ankles, that the dead man had a rented boat shed on the other side of the city, and that what was inside that boat shed was going to become the worst thing ever found inside an American city in the history of the country. The boy's name was Elmer Wayne Henley, 17 years old. He told the dispatcher, "I just killed Dean Call," and then he gave them an address on Silver Bell Street and said there were bodies there. The police drove to Silver Bell Street and opened the boat shed door. The smell hit them before their eyes adjusted to the dark. What they found inside began a process of excavation that would last weeks, across the boat shed floor, across beaches and woodlands at High Island and Lake Sam Rayburn and the Bolivar Peninsula, across a city that was about to understand that it had been hosting something monstrous for 3 years without registering a single alarm. 29 confirmed victims, all of them boys, all of them between 13 and 20 years old, all of them from the same tight radius of Houston Heights, Texas, all of them killed by the same man, in the same way, across 3 years of hunting that had happened in plain sight. At the time of discovery, what Dean Call did between 1970 and 1973 was the worst serial murder case in American history. That record still stands. This is his story. And the thing you need to understand before anything else is that this story is not really about a monster. Monsters are easy. Monsters live at the edge of normal life and you feel them when they get close. Something in you fires. You know, Dean Call did not trigger that response in anyone. He was, to the people who knew him, a pleasant and generous man, a steady worker, a good neighbor, a man who gave candy to children and remembered names and smiled easily and was always happy to give a teenager a lift or a place to hang out on a Friday night. That is the thing that makes this worth telling carefully, not the scale of what he did, the mechanism of it, how he built the access, how he made himself invisible, how he became, in the eyes of an entire community, exactly the opposite of what he actually was. Dean Arnold Call was born on Christmas Eve, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His parents named him Dean, a solid name, an unremarkable name. For a long time, it belonged to an unremarkable boy. His parents' marriage was troubled from the beginning. Years of separation and reconciliation and the particular damage that those cycles do to the children who live inside them. His mother Mary was capable and driven, the kind of woman who builds things from scratch through determination and will. His father Arnold was a less consistent presence. They divorced eventually, as they probably always were going to. Mary remarried. She moved the family to Texas, to Vida, where her new husband worked at a candy manufacturing company. The company would eventually become hers. She took it over, expanded it, moved it to Houston when Dean was in his teens. She called it the Pecan Prince Company, later Dean's Candy Company. It operated in Houston Heights, a working-class neighborhood of tight streets and modest houses, and the particular social density of communities where everyone knows everyone and their business. The Candy Company is not a metaphor. It is the engine of everything that came after. Remember it. Dean had something wrong with his heart, a congenital defect that required surgery and kept him away from the physical activities that defined teenage masculinity in 1950s. Texas, the sports, the roughhousing, the outdoor life that adolescent boys lived in that world. He was on the outside of that life looking in, watching, learning to read other people in the specific way of those who cannot participate fully, and so observe more carefully than those who can. He was quiet, not cold. He could be warm, could be funny, could engage when he chose, but self-contained in the way of people who have learned that the adults around them are not reliable enough to lean on. He developed an interior life that he kept carefully separate from what the people around him saw. By the time he was a teenager, he understood something about himself, that the world around him, 1950s Texas, Baptist communities, the specific culture of working-class Houston, had no language for except condemnation. He was attracted to boys, to younger boys. He understood that this could never be acknowledged, that it had to be managed, contained, hidden behind whatever surface he could build that would make him appear to the world as what the world expected him to be. He built that surface with some care. He worked. He helped his mother. He joined the National Guard when he was old enough, served his time, came back. He was employed, reliable, present in all the ways that the community could see and measure. And at the candy company, he found something that would define the next decade of his life. He found the children. The Pecan Prince Company was in the Heights. The neighborhood kids came in and out of the plant the way that neighborhood kids have always gathered around places that produce things they want. Dean was good with them, patient. He learned their names. He gave them candy for free. He crouched down to their level and talked to them like people rather than obstacles. And they liked him for it. And their parents noticed that the children liked him. And nobody questioned it because there was nothing in the visible surface of Dean Call's behavior toward those children that activated any alarm. He was the candy man, a nice man, a familiar man. The children grew into teenagers. The teenagers grew into young men. And Dean Call kept giving them things. Free candy first, then rides, then beer, then a place to be on a Friday night when their parents didn't know where they were and didn't have the time or the presence to find out. By the late 1960s, the candy company had closed. The economics hadn't worked out, and Call moved on to a job at Houston Lighting and Power as an electrician, but he stayed in the Heights. He kept his connections there. He had built something over a decade that was worth keeping. A specific social position, a known face, a reputation for generosity that gave him access to people and places that a stranger could never have had. He was 30 years old. He was offering parties to teenagers. Nobody stopped it because nobody had a reason to stop it yet. The alarm had not fired. The surface was clean. In 1970, everything changed. His name was David Brooks. He was 12, maybe 13, when he drifted into Call's orbit. A troubled kid from a difficult home, the kind of boy that the system around him had not quite caught. He was drawn in by the same combination that drew all the Heights boys. The generosity, the attention, the sense that Dean Call was different from other adults because he actually seemed interested in you. What happened between Call and Brooks over the following months is something investigators have spent decades trying to reconstruct from the pieces that survived. What is documented is this. At some point in 1970, Brooks walked in on Call with two boys in his apartment. Both were restrained. He understood what he had seen. He was 15 years old, and he understood, and he did not report it. Call bought him a car. Not a metaphor. An actual car. A transaction. Silence in exchange for something tangible. And with that exchange, David Brooks became the first link in a chain that would eventually stretch to 29 graves. The first confirmed victim was Jeffrey Conan, 18 years old, hitchhiking on September 25th, 1970. Cole picked him up in his van. Jeffrey's family did not know what had happened to him for 3 years. His mother kept his room exactly as it was, because keeping it was the only thing that felt like not giving up, and the police had told her he was probably a runaway. He was not a runaway. He was buried at High Island Beach, and he was there for 3 years before anyone looked. Cole moved quickly after Jeffrey. He was not tentative about this. He had been building toward it for years, had been thinking about it in the careful way of someone who plans, and now he had an accomplice who had demonstrated his silence could be purchased, and he used that to build the infrastructure he needed. In 1971, Brooks brought Cole a boy named Elmer Wayne Henley. Henley was 14, smart, streetwise, growing up in the specific financial and emotional difficulty of a working-class Heights family where money was short and supervision was limited. He needed things that Cole could provide. Money, primarily, but also a sense of somewhere to belong, of being valued by an adult who paid attention. Cole told him directly what he was offering. $200 per boy. Bring a boy to the address. Collect the money. Don't ask what happened next. $200. In 1971, to a 14-year-old from Houston Heights. Henley said yes. He has said, across decades of prison interviews, that he told himself the boys were being taken somewhere else, that some mechanism of willful blindness allowed him to not fully process what the $200 was purchasing. Whether you accept this account or not depends on what you believe about the human capacity for self-deception in impossible circumstances. What is not debatable is that Henley knew enough. He knew what the money was for. He chose to take it anyway. He was 14 years old. He had been targeted, identified, and bought by a man who had spent a decade learning how to identify and purchase people like him. He was a victim who became an accomplice. These two things are simultaneously true, and neither one cancels the other. In 1971, Cole rented a boat shed on Silver Bell Street. It was an ordinary structure, a storage unit in the administrative gap between public and private space, where nobody looks unless they have a reason. He had a reason. He needed somewhere that was not his apartment, not connected to his daily life, a space where what he intended could happen without proximity to the surface he maintained for the community. He built things inside it. A plywood board, roughly 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, with cuffs bolted at the 4 corners, wrists, ankles, positioned to hold a person immobile in a spread position. It was not improvised. It was designed with the specific engineering of something built for a purpose by someone who had thought carefully about that purpose. He had rope, handcuffs, other implements, whose inventory I will spare you, because the list serves horror for its own sake, and that is not why we are here. He was not improvising. He had built infrastructure. He had accomplices. He had a network of connection to his targets that a stranger could never have built. He had a decade of goodwill and familiarity and trusted adult status in a community where the boys he was targeting were already known to him by name. He was ready. The method was consistent enough that investigators could reconstruct it from multiple accounts. The survivors, the accomplices, the physical evidence from the shed, and the various apartments Cole occupied across 3 years of moving. He kept moving. 6 addresses across those 3 years, always in or near the Heights, always close enough to the community he was hunting to maintain the social access he depended on. The invitation was always some version of the same thing: a party, a place to hang out, beer and marijuana in a space where adults weren't going to impose rules. For a 13 or 14-year-old boy from Houston Heights in 1971, this was not a difficult offer to accept. The Heights was not wealthy. There was not much else. A party at Cole's place. filtered through a recommendation from a friend who had been there and come back and said it was fine, was not an obviously dangerous proposition. Some came willingly. Some were hitchhiking when call pulled over. Some came with a friend, which created a logistical problem that Call and his accomplices solved with chloral hydrate, dissolved into alcohol, producing a rapid sedation that made resistance impossible before the boy understood what was happening. The restraint happened quickly, before the alarm could fire at its proper volume, before the full weight of the situation could be processed. A boy was on the board, wrists and ankles held. The board's geometry eliminated useful movement even from a strong teenager. What Call said to them at this point varied. Survivors, the rare boys who were restrained and eventually released, who exist in the record as evidence that Call's operation was not always lethal, and who are among the most important witnesses to what he was, describe him as sometimes calm, sometimes threatening, sometimes offering false reassurance calibrated to prevent panic from escalating to noise. He told some of them they would be let go if they cooperated. These were lies that the boys understood to be lies, but the alternative to trying to believe them was a terror so complete that the mind resists it as a survival mechanism. Some were held for hours, some longer. He was not rushed. He had the space, the time, and 2 accomplices managing the perimeter. The killing was by strangulation or by gunshot from the .22 caliber pistol that would eventually be found at the scene of his death. A small caliber, quiet gun, a practical choice for residential areas. The strangulation was manual and by ligature, rope or cord applied with sustained deliberate pressure. The marks it left were clear on every victim who showed them. The burial was planned in advance, the boat shed floor prepared, the sites at High Island, Sam Rayburn, the Bolivar Peninsula, identified and used systematically. He transported the bodies in his van with Henley's assistance. The graves varied in depth, some shallow enough that the subsequent excavations found remains quickly, others requiring more work. But moving and burying 29 bodies across 3 years and multiple locations is a substantial operational undertaking. He did it with the discipline of someone who had committed completely. David Hillegius was 13 when he disappeared in May of 1971, the same day as his 14-year-old friend Gregory Malley Winkle. Both of them had been children who came to the candy company. Both of them had eaten Dean Call's free sweets as small boys. David's father, Alton, refused to accept the police's runaway explanation. He knocked on doors. He put up flyers. He pursued leads through years of his own investigation, coming closer than he knew, never close enough. David Hillegius' remains were in the boat shed. Alton was right about everything he suspected. He proved none of it until Henley's phone call proved it for him. Billy Balch was 17. His younger brother Michael was 15. They were killed separately, months apart, both brought through the network of acquaintance and trust. 2 brothers, 1 family. Their parents had 2 sons go into the Houston Heights streets and not come back, and spent years being told by the police that both boys had chosen to leave. James Drymala was 13 years old. He was the last victim. He was killed on August 3rd, 1973, 5 days before Henley picked up the phone. 5 days. He was the youngest. He died 5 days before the call that ended it. And through all of this, through the disappearances, through the families going to the police station and saying my son is gone and I am afraid, the Houston Police Department did not investigate. The boys fit a profile, teenagers, from a poor neighborhood, some history of running or minor trouble. The assumption was automatic. Runaways, chose to leave, will turn up or won't, but either way, there is no crime here. The assumption was not malicious. It was the specific blindness of a system that had decided, without ever stating it explicitly, that the disappearances of teenagers from certain backgrounds did not warrant the resources that the disappearances of other teenagers did. A hierarchy of concern that nobody had examined carefully enough to see what it was costing. What it cost was lives. The boys buried in 1972 and 1973 might have been alive if the first reports had been taken seriously. The families who spent years in the suspended grief of not knowing, too frightened to believe their sons had chosen to leave, unable to hold the alternative because the alternative was too large to hold without confirmation, deserved better than what they received. They kept calling. The police kept not coming. Until August the 8th, 1973. Henley had brought two people to Call's house on Lamar Drive in Pasadena that night. A 15-year-old girl named Rhonda Williams. A 15-year-old boy named Tim Curley. Call had not been told Henley was bringing a girl. He was angry. The presence of Rhonda Williams was a complication he had not planned for. They argued. And then Call did something that tells you more about how he understood his own operation than almost anything else in this story. He drugged all three of them, including Henley, his own accomplice, the boy he had been working with for 2 years, who had brought him victim after victim, who knew enough to destroy him. Call drugged Henley with the same casual confidence with which he had drugged every other boy in that apartment over 3 years, and he tied all three of them to the board. When Henley came back to consciousness, he was restrained. Call was clear about what was going to happen. The situation had developed to a point where Henley had become a liability. All three of them were going to die. Henley talked. He negotiated. He told Call he would help with the other two if Call released him. He was 17 years old and he was on the board, and the man who had used him for 2 years had just told him he was going to die, and he said whatever he needed to say to get off the board. Call released him. He gave Henley a knife and told him to begin on Tim Curley. Henley took the knife. He walked toward Curley, and then something that had apparently not happened at any point in the previous 2 years of his complicity happened inside Elmer Wayne Henley. He stopped. He went to the corner of the room where Call had left the .22 pistol. He picked it up. Call saw him and said, "And the accounts of this moment are consistent enough to feel credible. You won't do it." He shot him 6 times, in the head, in the shoulder, in the back. He kept firing until Call was on the floor and not moving. Then he untied Rhonda Williams and Tim Curley. Then he called the police. The smell hit the officers before anything else when they opened the boat shed door. The particular smell of decomposition in a sealed metal structure in August in Texas. They found the board inside, the restraints, the implements, and then they began to dig into the floor and find what Call had been putting there since 1971. 17 bodies in the shed, then more at the beaches and the woodland as Henley directed them to each site. The number climbed with every excavation. The Houston Police Department, which had dismissed dozens of missing persons reports from Heights families, which had told those families their sons were probably runaways, was now digging those same sons out of the ground. The identification process took weeks. Some victims were identified quickly from clothing or physical characteristics. Others required dental records, skeletal analysis, the slow, careful work of forensic identification. 28 were eventually named. 1 was not. One boy, found in the boat shed, age estimated between 13 and 18, killed at some point in the 3-year span, has never been identified. He is a John Doe in the records of the Houston mass murders. His face has been reconstructed from skeletal remains by forensic artists, and the images circulated repeatedly across 50 years of renewed effort. Nobody has recognized him. He is in the ground in Texas with a case number where his name should be. Dean Call knew his name. The list found in Call's possession, handwritten, coded in ways that investigators have spent decades trying to decode. is believed to reference victims beyond the 29 recovered. Not all the names on it have been matched to known individuals. Henley has said in every interview across 50 years of incarceration that 29 is not the right number, that there were more, that some sites were never searched. David Brooks was tried and convicted of 1 count of murder. He died in prison in 2020. Elmer Wayne Henley was tried and convicted of 6 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year terms. He has applied for parole multiple times. He has been denied each time. He is still incarcerated. The Houston Police Department was not held formally accountable for the dismissal of the missing persons reports. No officers were disciplined. No public inquiry was conducted. The families, who had spent years being told their grief was based on a misunderstanding, did not receive a formal apology. What they received was the news that their sons were in the ground. There is one more thing about Dean Call that I want to leave you with. He operated for 3 years in a community where people liked him, where parents trusted him with their children, where teenagers accepted rides and invitations from him without fear, because the boys who came back from his parties said it had been fine, and the boys who did not come back were assumed by the authorities to have run away. The community did not fail to notice. The community noticed. The families noticed. The fathers who went to the police station and came back without help. The mothers who kept their sons' rooms exactly as they were because keeping them was the only form of hope available. What failed was the alarm, the specific internal signal that human beings rely on to identify danger in the people around them. It did not fire on Dean Call because Dean Call had spent a decade making sure it wouldn't. The niceness was not incidental to the crimes. It was the crime's foundation. The candy was not a quirk of his biography. It was the mechanism of access. The remembered names, the free rides, the parties. These were not generosity. They were infrastructure. He gave candy to children, and then he waited for those children to grow into teenagers he could use. He was patient in the way of someone who understands that the thing he is building takes time. He was still building it when Elmer Wayne Henley picked up the gun. 29 boys. One of them still has no name. Dean Call knew what it was. He took it with him when he fell. Let me go back to something I moved past too quickly. The boys themselves. Not as a list, not as a number, as people. Because one of the specific cruelties of what Dean Call did was that the system around him, both during and after, had a tendency to process his victims as a category rather than as individuals. Teenagers from poor neighborhoods who disappeared. Runaways. A count that climbed. The worst serial murder case in American history. Behind every one of those descriptions is a specific boy with a specific life and specific people who loved him. Jeffrey Conan had been at the University of Texas at Austin. He was going home for the summer, hitching a ride on September 25th, 1970, the way young men hitchhiked in 1970 because it was a normal and accepted thing to do, and the world had not yet recalibrated around the risks of it. Dean Call picked him up. Jeffrey was 18 years old and probably looking forward to the summer ahead, and he did not come home. His family did not know what happened to him for 3 years. His mother kept his room. She kept it because keeping it was the only thing available to her that felt like not closing a door on him permanently. You do not shut the door on someone who might come back. You keep the door open and you wait. She waited 3 years. Then she was asked to come and identify remains. David Hilligist and Gregory Malley Winkle were 13 and 14 respectively. They disappeared on the same day in May of 1971. They had both been children who came to the candy company. They had eaten Dean Call's free sweets as small boys, had stood in the plant in Houston Heights, and been given something sweet by the man behind the counter, who remembered their names and crouched down to talk to them like people. David's father, Alton, was the parent who would not accept the runaway explanation. He was a man whose intelligence and persistence and refusal to let his grief be managed into compliance made him, in retrospect, one of the most clear-eyed people in this entire story. He knocked on doors throughout the Heights. He put up flyers. He went back to the police repeatedly and was turned away repeatedly. He followed leads that the police had dismissed. He came closer than he knew. Investigators who later reviewed his efforts believed he had been within a credible distance of the truth at multiple points. He never got there in time. David Hilligiust's remains were in the boat shed. The boat shed that Alton Hilligiust had never been told to look at because the Houston Police Department was not looking at it. He was right about everything. He proved nothing. The phone call on August 8th, 1973, proved it for him. Billy Balch was 17 when he disappeared in January of 1973. His younger brother Michael was 15 when he disappeared in July of the same year. They were killed separately, months apart, each brought to call through the same network. Two brothers from one family, two sons who went out one day and did not come back. Their parents had to absorb both absences, had to manage the hope and the dread for each boy simultaneously, had to keep going to the police and being told there was no crime. Both boys were in the boat shed. Charles Cobble was 17. Marty Ray Jones was 18. They were abducted together on the afternoon of July 25th, 1973, 2 weeks before Henley made his call. They were the last two victims killed before James Drymala, who was the last of all. James Drymala, 13 years old, from South Houston, killed on August 3rd, 1973. 5 days. He was 13, the youngest of the 29 confirmed victims, and he died 5 days before the phone call that ended it. I keep coming back to those 5 days because they represent the specific agony of retrospect. The knowledge that if the end had come 5 days earlier, James Drymala would have lived, that somewhere between the August 3rd that killed him and the August 8th that stopped call, there were 5 days during which James was alive and then was not, and the rest of the world did not know it yet. 5 days is not a long time. It is also forever, when it is the difference between a 13-year-old boy living and dying. The survivors are an important part of this story that the scale of the murders tends to obscure. Not all of the boys who were brought to call died. A small number were restrained and then released, either because call made the calculation that releasing them was less risky than killing them, or because the specific circumstances of a particular night made their deaths impractical. These survivors are the most direct witnesses to what happened inside call spaces, and their accounts form a crucial part of the documented record. They describe the board, the restraints, the process of being sedated and waking to find themselves immobilized, the specific quality of the space, the smell, the sounds from outside, the way light entered, the things Call said and did not say, the way he moved and the way he spoke, and the specific calibration of his behavior toward a person he had in his control. These accounts are difficult to read. They are also invaluable because they tell us something that the remains of the dead cannot tell us. They tell us what it was like to be inside what Dean Call built, to be in that room, on that board, understanding gradually and then completely what was happening. The survivors have lives now, decades of lives built on the other side of those experiences. They have largely not spoken publicly, and that silence is entirely their right. What they carry from those nights is not something they owe anyone an account of. What their existence tells us is that the operation was not perfectly lethal, that there were calculations made, decisions taken, moments where Call chose not to complete what he had started. The reasons for those choices are not documented and cannot be recovered. They existed in whatever passed for a decision-making process inside Dean Call, which is not a territory that anyone now living has access to. He is dead. He was shot 6 times on August 8, 1973. He never gave an account of himself. He never sat in a courtroom and was made to answer questions. He never explained the list, or the code in the list, or the names in the code that have never been matched to identified individuals. He took everything with him. There is a question that comes up every time this case is discussed, in every documentary and book and investigation that has engaged with it across 50 years. It is not the question of how many, though that question matters and remains open. It is a different question, a harder one. How did nobody know? The honest answer is that the question contains a false premise. People did know things. The families knew their sons were missing. The fathers who went to the police station knew something was wrong. Alton Hilligius knew, with a father's specific and unshakable certainty, that his son had not chosen to leave. The community knew, in the aggregate, that boys were disappearing from Houston Heights in numbers that were not normal. What the community did not know was what to do with that knowledge. The police were the mechanism through which individual families could convert private knowledge into public action, and the police were not taking the calls seriously. Each family's knowledge was isolated. One family's missing son. One set of parents making reports that were filed as runaway cases. The connection between the disappearances, the pattern that in retrospect is obvious and damning, was not visible to individual families because they did not have access to each other's reports. Call understood this. He did not operate on this understanding explicitly or strategically in any way the record shows, but the specific structure of how the disappearances were being processed worked in his favor regardless. The isolation of individual families, the bureaucratic categorization of each missing boy as a separate runaway case, the absence of any mechanism for connecting the pattern, all of this gave him operational cover that he did not have to construct. The system built it for him, and the system has not been fully held accountable for it. The Houston Police Department conducted no public inquiry into its handling of the missing persons reports from Heights families between 1970 and 1973. No policy review was conducted that examined the institutional assumption that produced the runaway categorization. No one was disciplined for the specific failures that allowed Dean Call to continue operating for 3 years, while families were being turned away from the front desks of police stations. The families who were turned away are mostly elderly now, those who are still alive. Some of them are dead. They carried the specific compound grief of losing a child and then being told officially that their child had chosen to leave, a grief that required them to hold 2 contradictory things simultaneously for years: the love for a son who was not there, and the official position that the son's absence was a choice. It was not a choice, it was Dean Call. And the system that should have stopped him or caught him, or at minimum taken the family's reports seriously enough to look, that system produced no formal reckoning with what it had and had not done. The families have been doing the reckoning themselves, in the specific and private way that families do, for 50 years. Elmer Wayne Henley was 17 years old when he fired those 6 shots. He is in his late 60s now. He has spent every year since 1973 in Texas prisons, appearing before parole boards that have denied him repeatedly, giving interviews to journalists and documentarians and researchers who are trying to understand what he knows and what he felt and what he was thinking across 2 years of bringing boys to Dean Call's addresses. His account of those 2 years has been consistent in its broad strokes and inconsistent in its specific details in ways that are characteristic of traumatic memory. The big shapes hold, the small ones shift. He maintains that he was manipulated and controlled by an adult who understood his vulnerabilities and used them against him. He maintains that some mechanism of self-deception allowed him to not fully process what the $200 per boy was funding. He maintains that the night of August 8th was the night something broke through that self-deception, and he finally understood completely what he had been doing. Whether all of this is true, whether it is partially true or strategically constructed, or some honest attempt to account for something that may not be fully accountable, is not a question that can be settled from outside his head. What can be said is that he was 14 when it began, that he had been identified and groomed by a man who spent a decade learning how to identify and groom people like him, and that the specific situation he was placed in, the gradual implication, the money, the complicity that made each subsequent step harder to refuse than the last, was designed by the man who designed it to be exactly the trap that it was. This does not resolve the moral weight of what Henley did. 6 consecutive 99-year sentences represent the legal system's assessment of that weight, and it is not a weight that disappears because its origins are complicated. But it is worth sitting with the fact that Dean Call's first victim, in the fullest sense of that word, was not Jeffrey Conan. It was David Brooks, at 12 or 13, bought with a car. And his second was Elmer Wayne Henley, at 14, bought with $200 and belonging. He built his operation on the exploitation of vulnerable boys, and then he used those vulnerable boys to find and deliver the others. The boat shed on Silver Bell Street does not exist anymore. The addresses where Call lived across his 3 years of moving through the Heights are just addresses now. Houses where other families have lived since, walls that hold no record of what was built and done in them. The community rebuilt itself in the way that communities do, carrying the shape of the loss inside a life that continued. There is a memorial. The victims are named. The families have aged, and some of them have died, carrying with them the particular knowledge of parents who were right about something terrible and could not prove it until the terrible thing proved itself. Alton Hilligius spent years trying to find out what happened to his son David. He was right about everything. He proved none of it. The phone call on August 8th, 1973, gave him the answer he had been pursuing for years. And the answer was the worst possible answer, and he had been right to pursue it. I think about him when I think about this case, about what it cost to be right in a situation like that, to know, with the specific certainty of a parent who knows their child, that the official explanation is wrong, to push against a system that has decided you are a grieving father looking for a runaway and has no more time for you, to keep pushing, to come close and not close enough and keep going anyway. He was right. His son was not a runaway. His son was in the boat shed on Silver Bell Street, and the boat shed was a few miles from the police stations where Alton Hilligius had sat across from officers who told him there was nothing to investigate. 29 names, one without a name, a list that has never been fully decoded. An unknown number of additional sites that have never been searched. Dean Call is dead. He was shot in a house in Pasadena, Texas, by a 17-year-old boy who had spent 2 years being used as a tool and finally stopped. The boy's name that Call took with him, the John Doe in the boat shed, the one face that forensic reconstruction has never been able to identify, is still out there somewhere. In a family that lost someone and never found out why, in a record that has no match. If you are the kind of person who believes in the weight of unresolved things, and most people are at some level, in the specific quiet hours of a night, then that name is still out there somewhere in the dark, waiting. In 2004, a woman named Donna Pendergrass received a phone call from a journalist in Texas who asked her a simple question. What is Michigan doing about Coral Eugene Watts? Pendergrass was the principal homicide attorney for Wayne County, Michigan. She had spent her career dealing with killers. She was not easily surprised by the names that came across her desk. She did not know this one. In 2004, a woman named Donna Pendergrass received a phone call from a journalist in Texas who asked her a simple question. What is Michigan doing about Coral Eugene Watts? Pendergrass was the principal homicide attorney for Wayne County, Michigan. She had spent her career dealing with killers. She was not easily surprised by the names that came across her desk. She did not know this one. She said, "Who?" And then she started researching. And her blood, she would later say, went cold. Because Donna Pendergrass had been a student at the University of Michigan in the early 1980s. She had lived through what the university community of Ann Arbor called the Sunday morning slasher year, the period when women on and around campus were being attacked and killed in the early hours of Sunday mornings with a consistency and a brutality that had put an entire city on high alert. She remembered that year. She remembered what it felt like to be a young woman in that city during those months. She had no idea in 1980 that the police had actually identified a suspect, that they had been watching him, that they had watched him closely enough to understand what he was doing and not been able to prove enough to hold him. She had no idea that the man they had been watching had simply left Michigan when the surveillance got too close, driven south to Texas, and started again. She had no idea that in Texas he had killed at least 12 more women before being arrested in 1982, that he had then done something almost incomprehensible, negotiated a deal with Texas prosecutors that gave him complete immunity from prosecution for those 12 murders in exchange for confessing to them, that he had received a 60-year sentence for a burglary charge instead of a murder conviction, that a quirk of Texas sentencing law had made him eligible for release after only 24 years. She had no idea that Coral Eugene Watts, the Sunday morning slasher, the man who investigators believed may have killed as many as 100 women, was about to walk out of a Texas prison in 2 years. When she finished her research, she understood what the journalist had been asking. She understood that she had very little time. This is the story of Carl Eugene Watts, and it is, in some specific ways, a more disturbing story than most in this category. Not because the violence was more extreme, though it was extreme, and not because the scale was larger, though by some estimates it was the largest in American history. It is more disturbing because of what the system did with him. How many times the alarm fired and nothing happened. How many women died in the gap between an alarm that fired and a justice system that failed to act on it. And how close, incredibly, unacceptably close, he came to walking free with a handshake and a bus ticket. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7th, 1953, in Killeen, Texas. His father, Richard, was a private first class in the Army. His mother, Dorothy, was a kindergarten art teacher. His parents separated before Carl was 2 years old. Dorothy raised him largely alone, eventually moving the family to Inkster, Michigan, where she remarried a mechanic named Norman Caesar and built a new life. Carl was a quiet child, described by people who knew him young as polite, soft-spoken, not the kind of boy who drew attention to himself. He was physically large and strong for his age, athletic, the kind of boy who moved with controlled power. He participated in Golden Gloves boxing. He seemed, on the surface, like a kid who might amount to something. Then, around the age of 8, he got sick, meningitis, an infection of the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord, which in its serious forms produces high fevers, severe neurological disruption, cognitive effects that can persist long after the fever breaks. Carl's case was significant enough to affect his development in ways that became apparent when he returned to school. He struggled. He was held back a grade. He was reading at a 3rd grade level when he was 16. His mother attributed it to the illness, to the fevers, to whatever the meningitis had done to the architecture of his thinking. The family noticed something else changed too. Before the illness, Carl had been relatively open. After it, something shifted. He became withdrawn, interior, harder to reach. He described, later in his life, a specific experience that had begun in the period following the meningitis and never left him. Dreams, recurring, intrusive, vivid dreams about women, about hurting them, about killing them. Not dreams he woke from reluctantly, invasive ones that interrupted sleep and lingered into waking, that carried an emotional charge he could not articulate, but that shaped his hours in the specific way of something that will not leave. He said, when investigators eventually asked him why he killed women, that he could see evil in their eyes, that the women he targeted had evil spirits, that killing them was a way of freeing those spirits, that he was not harming them, he was releasing them from something that lived inside them that was worse than death. This is not a defense. Psychiatrists and psychologists who evaluated Watts across his criminal history found him legally sane, found him capable of understanding what he was doing and that it was wrong. The evil eyes explanation is the account of a man who had built a belief system that permitted what he intended to do regardless of any external framework of right and wrong. A rationalization so thoroughly embedded, it had become genuine. He had told himself the story so many times it had become, for him, simply the truth. By 12 years old, he later said, he was relishing the dreams. By 13, he was stalking girls in his neighborhood. By 15, the fantasies had broken through into daylight. On June 25th, 1969, Carl Watts was a 15-year-old paperboy delivering his morning route in a Detroit apartment building. He knocked on the door of a 26-year-old woman named Joan Garve. When she opened it, he attacked her. He was large and powerful. Joan Garve was significantly smaller. He beat her in her doorway on a Tuesday morning. She survived. He was arrested. He told the police, when they asked why, that he just felt like beating someone up. He was 15. He was sent for psychiatric evaluation. The evaluators described him as dangerous. They warned that he was likely to commit further violence. He was placed in a facility. He received treatment. In November of 1969, he was released. The system had seen him, had produced a written conclusion that he was dangerous and would reoffend, had released him. He graduated from high school in 1973 and received a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. He went. He began stalking women on campus immediately. He was reprimanded. He escalated. A female student was found murdered, stabbed 33 times. Carl became the prime suspect. There was not enough evidence to charge him. Lane College expelled him. He transferred to Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. In October of 1974, a 20-year-old student named Gloria Steele was found dead. 33 stab wounds. The same number, the same ferocity. Carl Watts was arrested. Charges were dropped for lack of evidence. He walked out. 2 victims, the same method, the same number of wounds, the same suspect. Released both times. He kept going. Through the mid-1970s, Watts operated in Michigan with the specific patience of someone who had learned precisely where the edges of what the system could prove were located. He knew that physical evidence was what convicted people. He knew that witnesses were the other mechanism. He structured his attacks to minimize both. He did not commit sexual assault in the way that most killers of women do, which meant the biological evidence that ties perpetrators to victims was absent from his crime scenes. He chose strangers. He varied his methods: strangulation, stabbing, drowning, bludgeoning, in ways that made pattern recognition across jurisdictions difficult. He attacked in multiple cities, multiple counties, multiple states, which meant that the investigators who might connect the pattern were working in different departments with limited ability to share information in the mid-1970s. He was also watching, stalking, patient and systematic in his selection, not explosive or impulsive, but deliberate. The preparation of someone who thought carefully about risk before acting. Women who lived alone, women walking at particular hours, routes that offered low witness probability, times when the streets were quiet. Ann Arbor police identified him as a suspect. The investigator who became most consumed by the case was Paul Bunton, whose jurisdiction overlapped with Ann Arbor's. Bunton did not let go of things. He identified Watts. He communicated this to Watts directly. They had conversations in which Bunton told him he knew what he was doing. Watts responded with the calm of someone who understood the difference between being suspected and being convicted. He knew Bunton could not prove it. The attacks through the late 1970s continued. The university community of Ann Arbor named the perpetrator the Sunday morning slasher, because the pattern held to Sunday mornings with a consistency that investigators found both useful for identification and disturbing for what it implied about the planning behind the timing. Sunday mornings were supposed to be peaceful, safe. The specific cruelty of that timing was not lost on anyone. By 1980, the police surveillance of Watts was round the clock, constant. He was watched every hour of every day. He noticed. He packed his things and drove south. Ann Arbor police sent a bulletin to Houston police. They detailed their suspicions, Watts's identifying information, the attacks they attributed to him. Houston received it. Watts was never closely watched. In the 11 months between his arrival in Texas and his arrest in May of 1982, he killed at least 12 women. He worked as a mechanic. He had an apartment. He had neighbors who did not suspect him. The surface was what it had always been. Unremarkable, quiet, the specific invisibility of a man who has learned that staying below the level of attention is itself a form of protection. The Texas killings were faster and more concentrated than Michigan. He had operated there across nearly a decade. In Texas, he compressed what he was doing into 11 months, which reflects either an escalation in the compulsion or the specific freedom of a man who no longer felt the weight of sustained police attention. Probably both. Elena Samander was 20 years old. She had a field hockey scholarship at the University of Denver and had transferred back to Houston because she missed her family, her Texas roots, the specific pull of home that some people feel regardless of where else they go. She was studying mathematics and physical education at the University of Houston. Athletic, driven, a week from her 21st birthday. Watts strangled her in February of 1982. He put her body in a dumpster. Her sister Joanna has spoken publicly about Elena across the decades since, about who she was and what the family lost, about what it meant when they learned years later that the man who killed her was about to be released on a technicality, that the state of Texas had made a deal with a hidden clock built into it that nobody had told the families existed. Elizabeth Montgomery and Susan Wolfe were killed on the same day, 2 hours apart. 2 women, the same Tuesday, the same man, moving through Houston with a speed that suggested he had stopped carefully calculating each individual risk. The pattern accelerated through the first months of 1982. The task force that Houston formed in early May to look at 40 unsolved homicides of women over the previous 2 years was still organizing when Watts made the mistake that ended it. On the night of May 22nd, into the early hours of May 23rd, 1982, Watts spotted a woman leaving a Houston nightclub. He followed her home. Her name was Michelle Madej. She was 20 years old. It was her birthday. He strangled her outside her apartment building and carried her body inside and placed it in the bathtub. Then he moved to a nearby apartment complex, looking for what came next. He found a second-floor apartment where 2 women lived. Roommates, 22-year-old Lori Lister and 18-year-old Melinda Aguilar. Melinda had her hand on the doorknob when it opened from the outside. Standing in the doorway was a large man in a red sweatshirt with the hood pulled up. She could see, she said later, only the whites of his eyes. He grabbed her by the throat. He told her if she screamed, he would kill her. He tied her hands. He turned to Laurie Lister. He began filling the bathtub with water. What happened next in that apartment is something Melinda Aguilar has described in interviews across the decade since, and the detail she returns to every time. The detail that has stayed in every account of the Watts case that has been written since is not the threat or the restraint or the filling bathtub. It is his demeanor in those minutes. He was excited, hyper, clapping his hands and making sounds like this was going to be fun, like a man who had stopped performing any version of normal and was being, without pretense or management, exactly what he was. He clapped and he jumped. Melinda Aguilar was 18 years old. Her hands were tied behind her back. Laurie Lister was being held in place, and the bathtub was filling with water, and the man in the red sweatshirt was clapping his hands in anticipation. She went to the balcony door. She looked at the ground below. A second-floor drop, concrete, the kind of fall that breaks things. She looked back at the man with the filling bathtub. She jumped. She hit the railing on the way down, and her head connected with it hard enough to matter. She landed on the ground. She ran, bound wrists behind her, to the nearest neighbor's door, and she screamed. Neighbors called the police. Officers arrived within minutes. Patrol Officer Don Schmidt found Watts running. He later said he thought he was going to have to shoot him to stop him. He didn't. He tackled him. Carl Eugene Watts was arrested on May 23, 1982, in Houston, Texas. Laurie Lister was still alive. The neighbors reached her before he had finished what he had started. In a nearby apartment, Michelle Madej was in a bathtub. She was 20 years old. It had been her birthday. Watts was in a cell. He said nothing. He sat in the specific quiet of a man running calculations. The Houston police had a problem. They had Watts. They had Melinda Aguilar's testimony, which was credible and specific and damning. They had the physical evidence from the apartment. They had Michelle Madej's body. What they did not have was physical evidence connecting him to the other women who had died in Houston in the previous 11 months, or to anything in Michigan. The task force examined 40 unsolved homicides with Watts in mind. The circumstantial picture was overwhelming to the investigators, who understood what they were looking at. What it was not was physically evidenced in ways that would produce certain murder convictions in court. Harris County Assistant District Attorney Ira Jones made a calculation. He offered Watts a deal. Plead guilty to 1 count of burglary with intent to commit murder for the Aguilar and Lister attack. Accept a 60-year sentence. In exchange, confess in detail to the other murders. Lead investigators to the bodies. Give the families answers that the physical evidence alone could never give them, and receive complete immunity from prosecution for every murder he confessed to. Watts accepted. He spent over a week confessing. Detectives drove with him through Houston. He stood at the edges of drainage ditches and shallow graves and spoke in the calm, unhurried, specific way of someone recalling things that mattered to him with clarity. He was never confused about which victim was which. He was never imprecise about details. He led them to 3 graves. He confessed to 12 murders in Texas, 13 total. Detective Tom Ladd, who took the confession, later said Watts was the calmest person he had ever sat across from in an interrogation room. The composure of a man who had made his deal and was executing it. Jones believed the 60-year sentence was effectively a life sentence. He believed he had gotten the best available outcome. He closed the file. What Jones had not fully accounted for was a feature of Texas sentencing law that would not become apparent for a decade. Texas law at the time allowed first-time felony offenders to earn sentence reductions for good behavior. Watts had no prior felony conviction on his record. None of the dropped charges, none of the psychiatric placements, none of the arrests had resulted in a felony. He was legally a first-time offender. Under the good time credit system, this made him eligible for release after approximately 24 years. Not 60, 24. In 1992, someone ran the numbers. Carl Eugene Watts was scheduled for release in 2006. The families of his victims found out through a journalist, not through official notification, not through any system designed to inform them of what the deal they had never been asked about contained, through a reporter who happened to be covering something else and understood the implications of what the sentencing calculation meant. Elena Samanda's family found out this way. The families of the 12 women he had confessed to killing found out this way. They had been told when the deal was made that he was going to prison for 60 years. They had not been told about the good time provision. They had not been told that 60 years meant 24. They organized. They went public. The story of the Sunday morning slasher who had confessed to 12 murders and received immunity for all 12 and was about to be released became national news in a way that his crimes had never managed to be. Andy Carhan, a victims' rights advocate in Houston who fought the release harder than almost anyone, made the observation that became the defining sentence of the public debate. Everyone in America knows Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Mention Coral Watts, and 99% of the public has no idea who you are talking about. He may have killed more people than all three of them combined, and he was about to go home. Donna Pendergrass worked fast. Michigan had never been part of the Texas immunity deal. The Texas prosecutors had not consulted Michigan before making the arrangement. Michigan's open cases, the attacks that Bunton had attributed to Watts, the deaths from the late 1970s, the Sunday morning slasher year that Pendergrast had lived through as a student, were still unsolved cases in open files in Michigan police departments. Michigan was not bound by what Texas had decided. The question was whether Michigan could build a case strong enough to convict in the time remaining before 2006. The answer depended on a witness named Joseph Foy. In 1979, in Ferndale, Michigan, a woman named Helen Dutcher had been stabbed to death outside her apartment building. Foy had seen the man who did it. He had been close enough to see the face, close enough to make the specific visual registration that happens when the brain understands it is looking at something dangerous. When Watts was arrested in Texas in 1982 and his photograph appeared in news coverage, Foy saw it. He recognized the face immediately, the way you recognize something you never expected to see again but never forgot. He called the authorities. He told them he had seen this man outside Helen Dutcher's building the night she was killed. He called twice. Both times, nothing happened. The Texas deal had been made. The momentum behind Michigan pursuing anything when Watts was already serving 60 years in Texas was limited. Foy's calls were filed. He called periodically for 20 years. Pendergrass found him in 2002. He was still there. He still remembered. He had been carrying the face for 23 years and had not let it blur or doubt itself. He was ready. Michigan charged Watts with Helen Dutcher's murder. They brought Foy into a courtroom. He looked at Watts and identified him without hesitation. The jury convicted. Life without parole. They charged him with Gloria Steele as well, the Western Michigan University student stabbed 33 times in 1974. Conviction. Second life sentence. 2006 came. Watts was not released. He was in a Michigan prison with 2 life sentences, finally held by something that could not be dismantled by a good time provision or a plea deal technicality. Carl Eugene Watts died on September 21, 2007, in a Michigan prison hospital. Prostate cancer. He was 53 years old. He died having served time for burglary in Texas and murder in Michigan, without having been convicted of a single one of the 12 Texas murders he had confessed to in detail, stood at the graves of, and received immunity for. He took the complete count with him. He said 40 to one investigator. He said 80 to another. He implied more still to a third. He was never fully specific, never gave the complete accounting that would have let investigators close files and families have answers, because the one piece of leverage he had retained across decades of imprisonment was the knowledge of what he had done and where, and he used it until he had nothing left to use. Paul Bunton, the police chief who had identified Watts in Michigan and watched him drive to Texas and spent decades knowing what that drive had cost, never stopped carrying the case. The specific weight of a thing you knew and could not stop. That is a different kind of weight from the things you did not know. He had known. He had documented. He had watched. He had been unable to prevent what happened in Texas because the system between his knowing and Watts being stopped had gaps wide enough for 12 more women to die in. Melinda Aguilar was 18 years old on the night she jumped from that balcony. She hit the railing. She landed on concrete. She ran with her hands tied behind her back, and she screamed until someone heard her. She saved her roommate. She ended the spree. She is the reason that 2006 came and went with Watts still in custody, because without her arrest, there was no Texas conviction to serve as the anchor that kept him in place, while Michigan built its case. She described his eyes as evil in the aftermath of that night. He had said the same thing about the women he killed. The difference between them is everything. Elena Samanda would have turned 45 the week she was killed. Michelle Madej was celebrating her 20th birthday. Gloria Steele had her whole university life still ahead of her. Helen Dutcher was walking home. They are in the documented record. Their names are attached to deaths that the man who caused them confessed to in detail and was immune from prosecuting for in the jurisdiction where he caused them. The total number of women Carl Eugene Watts killed is not known. It will never be known. He carried it into a prison hospital in Michigan, and it went with him when he died. What is known is the specific count the system had the chance to stop him and did not. The psychiatric facility in 1969, the Lane College murder, the Gloria Steele arrest, the Michigan surveillance that drove him to Texas instead of into a courtroom, the Ann Arbor bulletin that Houston filed without watching him. Each gap had a cost. The cost was measured in women. Remember their names. They were not victims in the abstract. They were people who had lives ahead of them and did not get to live them, because the distance between a system knowing and a system acting was, for Carl Eugene Watts, wider than it should ever have been allowed to become. Let me go deeper on the Michigan years because they are the foundation of everything that followed, and they deserve more than a summary. After the Gloria Steele arrest and the dropped charges, Watts returned to the Western Michigan University area and continued. The investigators who later reconstructed the timeline of his Michigan years have identified victims dating from 1974 through to his departure for Texas in early 1981. 7 years of attacks across multiple jurisdictions, multiple counties, different cities, within a state that did not yet have the mechanisms to connect what was happening across those distances. The specific horror of the Michigan period is the number of times the alarm fired and the response was inadequate. Not absent, the police were not ignoring the problem, but inadequate in ways that produced the specific outcome of a suspect who remained free long enough to kill again and again and then drive away. Watts stalked before he attacked. This is documented in survivor accounts and in the observations of investigators who watched him, and it is important because it means that many of the women he eventually attacked had noticed him before the attack occurred. They had seen him. Some of them had reported being followed. Some had told friends or family that a man was watching them. The specific dread of being stalked, the instinctive recognition that something is wrong before you can prove it, was experienced by women who were later among his victims. And that recognition did not save them, because the system around them did not have a mechanism to act on reported surveillance before it became something more. He had a specific look that people who encountered him described in consistent terms. Large, still, the eyes. Multiple survivors and witnesses across Michigan and Texas described his eyes independently, with a consistency that investigators found striking, not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as a specific quality of the way he looked at women that registered as wrong before the brain had processed why. Melinda Aguilar described them as evil after her escape, the same word, used by different people who had seen him at different times in different circumstances, attached itself to the same feature. He chose women who were alone, women returning from night shifts or late nights, women walking to or from their cars in the specific early morning hours when streets are quiet and the distance between one person and the next is large. Women in apartment buildings where the hallways at 3 or 4 in the morning offer exactly the privacy that what he was doing required. Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, Kalamazoo, Detroit. The geography of his Michigan years spread across the south of the state in the way of someone who understood that concentration produced pattern recognition and pattern recognition produced arrest. He moved between cities as the investigation in any one place intensified. He was, in a specific and terrible way, adaptive. The system changed around him, and he changed with it. Paul Bunton watched this happen over years. He had Watts as his suspect. He communicated this certainty to Watts in person, to his supervisors in formal reports, to other agencies through official channels. He built the most comprehensive circumstantial case the available evidence allowed. What he could not build was the physical connection, the biological evidence, the eyewitness to the act itself, that would take Watts from a suspect the police were certain about to a defendant a jury could convict. The surveillance that eventually drove Watts out of Michigan was the most significant action Bunton could take without that physical evidence, and it worked in the limited sense that Watts left. It did not work in the sense that it stopped him. It moved the problem south and gave it 11 more months in Texas before a 19-year-old woman's decision to jump from a balcony created the arrest that the previous decade had not been able to produce. The Texas women deserved their names said clearly and their lives described beyond the manner of their deaths. Elena Samander was born in 1962 in Houston. She was athletic and academically driven. The field hockey scholarship to the University of Denver was not a courtesy. It was earned. She transferred back to Texas because Houston was home, and home had a pull that an academic scholarship in Colorado could not fully override. She was studying mathematics and physical education at the University of Houston, building towards something that was still taking shape when Watts stopped it in February of 1982. She was 20 years old. She was a week from 21. Her sister Joanna has spent decades since making sure Elena is not reduced to a case number in the story of the man who killed her. Elizabeth Montgomery and Susan Wolfe. 2 women, the same day, 2 hours apart. The specific brutality of that detail, the same Tuesday, the same man, is a thing that does not get smaller the more you look at it. Phyllis Jefferson, Carrie Jefferson, Margaret Fossey, whose husband Lawrence would spend years fighting Watts's possible release with every legal tool he could find, because the alternative was watching the man who killed his wife walk out of a Texas prison, having served 24 years for 12 murders. The victims span the months from late 1981 through May of 1982. They are documented in the confession Watts gave, which was detailed enough and specific enough that investigators never seriously doubted its accuracy. He remembered where he had put bodies. He remembered the sequence. He remembered details that could only have been known by someone who was there. He confessed to all of it in exchange for immunity from all of it. The families of those women learned about the deal after it was made. They were not consulted. They were not warned. They were informed eventually through official channels that described the deal as the best available outcome. The confessions, the body locations, the closure. And they were expected to accept that framing. Some of them did not. Margaret Fossey's husband, Lawrence, did not. He became one of the central figures in the public campaign to prevent Watts's release, working with victims' rights advocates and journalists, and anyone willing to listen to the argument that a 60-year sentence was meaningless if it actually meant 24, and that the immunity deal had been made without the knowledge or consent of the people most directly affected by it. The campaign was visible and sustained, and it mattered, not because it changed the legal situation, which the immunity deal had locked, but because it generated the public attention that eventually reached Donna Pendergrast in Michigan. The journalist who called her in 2002 had been covering the release campaign in Texas. The connection that saved the situation was made because families who refused to be silent created enough noise that a reporter in Texas called a prosecutor in Michigan and asked a question that changed what happened next. The Michigan prosecution of Carl Eugene Watts was one of the more remarkable legal efforts in the history of serial killer cases, for the specific reason that it succeeded where everyone had assumed it would fail. The cases were old. The physical evidence was limited or non-existent. The witnesses who remembered were remembering things from 2 and 3 decades earlier. The specific challenges of prosecuting someone for crimes committed in the 1970s, in 2003 and 2004, with the standards of evidence that modern juries expected, were substantial. What Pendergrast had was Joseph Foy. Foy had seen the man who killed Helen Dutcher in 1979. He had seen him close enough to register the face in the specific way that faces register when the encounter is frightening, and the brain is paying maximum attention. He had called about it in 1982 and been heard but not acted upon. He had called periodically for 20 years. He had maintained a certainty across a quarter century that investigators who worked cold cases will tell you is rare and, when it exists, tends to be real. When Pendergrast found him and told him there might finally be a use for what he knew, Foy was ready. He had been ready for years. He had simply been waiting for someone to pick up the phone. The trial of Carl Eugene Watts for the murder of Helen Dutcher was, by the standards of cold case prosecutions, not a long or complicated proceeding. The case was built on Foy's identification, on the pattern of Watts's behavior in the period, on what investigators had documented about his Michigan years. Watts's defense challenged the identification. The jury heard Foy's testimony, heard the challenge, and returned a verdict: guilty, life without parole. The second prosecution, Gloria Steele, Western Michigan University, 1974, followed: conviction, second life sentence. The 2006 release date arrived. Watts was not at the door waiting to be let out. He was in a Michigan prison, finally held by something that the good time provision and the immunity deal and the dropped charges and the surveillance that drove him south had not been able to produce for the previous 37 years. He was convicted. He was where he belonged. He was not free. He died there on September 21st, 2007. Prostate cancer, 53 years old. He had been a serial killer for the entirety of his adult life, had killed across 2 states across 13 years, had confessed to 12 murders and been immune from all 12, and had come within 2 years of walking out with a bus ticket. He died without giving the complete accounting, the full number, the names in the other states he had implied to investigators, the crimes between Michigan and Texas, the crimes before Michigan, the crimes that nobody had a body for or a date or a victim name that could be attached to what he described. He took all of it. What the Watts case left behind is a specific and lasting argument about how the system handles killers who understand the system better than the system handles them. He was evaluated at 15 and found dangerous and released. He was arrested for the Steele killing and released. He was watched by Michigan police for years and never caught. He drove to Texas with a police bulletin preceding him that produced no meaningful surveillance. He was arrested in Texas and given immunity for 12 murders in exchange for a guilty plea on a lesser charge. He was nearly released on a sentencing technicality that nobody had explained to the families of his victims when the deal was made. At each point, the system had him in some form and let him go in some form. The pattern is not the result of malice. The prosecutors who dropped charges did not have the evidence to do otherwise. The deal that Jones made was not obviously wrong in the terms available to him at the time. The Michigan surveillance was the most significant action possible without a physical case. The pattern is the result of a system that was not designed for a person who operated in the specific way Watts operated. He left no DNA. He chose strangers. He varied his methods. He moved between jurisdictions. He killed without apparent sexual motivation in the conventional sense, which removed the biological evidence that most violent crime investigations depend on. He was physically imposing enough to overpower victims quickly, reducing the chance of defensive wounds or transferred evidence. He did not keep trophies or maintain contact with the investigation in ways that produced incriminating behavior. He was, in the cold technical language of the field, a highly effective predator. The things that made him effective were the same things that made the system's repeated failures to stop him possible. He had found the gaps and he lived in them for 13 years, until an 18-year-old woman with tied hands made a decision that closed the final gap for good. Melinda Aguilar jumped from that balcony and ran and screamed and created the arrest. Without the arrest, there was no Texas conviction. Without the Texas conviction as the anchor, Michigan's effort to build a case before 2006 would have been working against a release date instead of working against a man already in custody. The whole chain of consequences, the immunity deal scrutiny, the public campaign, Pendergrass call, Foy's testimony, the Michigan convictions, the life sentences, all of it runs back to the moment Aguilar made her decision on a second-floor balcony in Houston in the early morning hours of May 23rd, 1982. She was 18. Her hands were tied. The alternative was the bathtub. She jumped anyway. That is the story of Carl Eugene Watts, a man who killed across 2 states and possibly more for 13 years, who the system saw repeatedly and could not hold, who negotiated immunity for 12 murders and nearly walked free 24 years into a 60-year sentence, who died in prison only because Michigan built a case on a witness who had been calling about it for 20 years, and finally reached someone who picked up the phone and asked the right questions. The full count of what he did is in a Michigan prison hospital, where it went when he died. What we know is enough to understand what was lost. What we will never know is how much more there was. There is a house in Salem, Oregon, that looks exactly like every other house on its street. 2 stories, suburban, a yard, a driveway, the particular architectural ordinariness of a neighborhood built for families in the 1960s, the kind of street where people knew each other's names and children rode bikes in the summer, and nobody locked their doors until they had a reason to. Inside that house, in the years between 1968 and 1969, a man named Jerry Brudos was living what appeared to be a completely normal life. He had a wife. Her name was Darcy. He had 2 children. He worked as an electronics technician, a steady, skilled job that required intelligence and patience, and the specific kind of disciplined attention to detail that employers value. He was known in the neighborhood as a quiet, unremarkable man. He fixed things. He was good with his hands. He had a workshop in the garage that he spent a lot of time in, and his family had learned not to disturb him when he was out there because he was working on his projects and he didn't like to be interrupted. His wife did not go into the garage. She did not go into the garage because Jerry had told her the garage was his space, and the garage had a padlock on it, and the padlock was always locked when Jerry was not in there, and sometimes locked when he was. This was simply how it was. Jerry had his garage, and Darcy had the rest of the house, and that was the arrangement. What was in the garage is the reason this story exists. What was in the garage, hanging from a ceiling hook, dressed in lingerie and high heels, photographed by a man, who then went back inside for dinner with his wife and children, is the thing that makes the specific horror of Jerry Brudos different from the horror of the killers who operated in the dark, who had no families, who lived at the margins where the alarm was already primed to fire. Jerry Brudos lived in the middle. He lived in the specific, well-lit, observable middle of ordinary suburban life, and what he was doing in the garage was happening 15 feet from where his children slept. This is his story, and the thing you need to sit with before it begins is this. The most disturbing element of the Jerry Brudos case is not what he did to his victims, though what he did to his victims is deeply disturbing. The most disturbing element is where he did it, and who was in the next room, and how completely, for 15 months, the surface of a normal life concealed what the garage contained. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota. He was the second son of Henry and Eileen Brudos, and from the moment he arrived, he was a disappointment. Eileen had wanted a daughter. She had carried a second pregnancy hoping for a girl, and when Jerry was born, another boy, another wrong outcome. Something in the way she related to him was marked by that original disappointment in ways that would accumulate across his childhood and leave specific damage. She was not warm with him, not consistently, not reliably. She criticized him. She directed a particular kind of resentment at him that children absorb and cannot process properly. The resentment of a parent who sees in a child the evidence of a wish that did not come true. There are accounts of her forcing the young Jerry to wear dresses, a punishment or a cruelty, or possibly both simultaneously, the specific blurring of the two that characterizes some forms of childhood abuse. The family moved to Portland, Oregon when Jerry was young, and it was there, when he was 5 years old, that something happened which the investigators and psychiatrists who eventually studied his case would spend considerable time examining. He found a pair of high-heeled women's shoes in a junkyard. He was 5. He picked them up. He took them home, and he put them on. The way small children put on adult shoes, the way that children try on the physical things of the adult world before they understand what those things mean. He wore them around the house. Eileen found him. Her reaction was not the bemused exasperation of a parent finding a small child in amusing footwear. She reacted with something considerably more intense, with anger, with disgust, with a force of response that was disproportionate to the act in ways that the child who experienced it could not fully understand, but could not fail to feel. She took the shoes. She told him he was not to touch women's shoes. He thought about those shoes for the rest of his life. This is not a neat psychological explanation of what Jerry Brudos became. A child finding shoes in a junkyard and being punished for wearing them does not, in any straightforward causal chain, produce a serial killer. The world is full of people who had difficult mothers and complicated childhoods, and who do not kidnap and murder women. The shoes are not the origin story in the clean, simple way that retrospective accounts sometimes want them to be, but the shoes are the beginning of something. the beginning of a fixation that Eileen's reaction to them had perhaps made inevitable, because the specific thing that gets most forcefully forbidden to a child in a vulnerable developmental period is the thing that the child's mind returns to with a persistence that increases in proportion to the prohibition. She told him never to touch women's shoes again. He thought about women's shoes for the rest of his life. By the time he was a teenager, he was stealing them. Night raids on neighbors' houses. He slipped through windows or unlocked doors in the specific quiet hours of suburban Oregon nights, and he took shoes. He took women's underwear. He built a collection of these things in the way that people build collections of things they need but cannot have openly. He hid them. He kept them in places his family would not look. He was also watching women, following them, the particular predatory attention of someone who has decided that the world owes him something and is looking for the moment when he can take it. At 17 years old, in 1956, he crossed a line that the stealing had been approaching. He abducted a teenage girl. He took her to a remote area. He threatened to stab her if she did not comply with what he wanted. She did not comply. She fought back, and whatever he had intended was not completed. But what he had done was enough. He was arrested. He was sent to Oregon State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. The evaluation found things that the evaluators documented in language that is clinical and precise, and that, read across the distance of decades, produces the specific discomfort of a record that knew what it was looking at and released him anyway. He was diagnosed. His sexual fantasies were examined and understood to revolve around domination, around women's shoes and undergarments, around a specific and structured inner world that had been developing since childhood and that showed no signs of abating. The evaluators understood what they were dealing with. He was held for 9 months. Then he was released. He graduated from high school with his class in 1957. He became an electronics technician. He suppressed, for a period, what the suppression was costing him. He functioned. He did the things that functioning adults do. He worked. He saved. He appeared to the people around him as a man who had sorted himself out. In 1961, he married a 17-year-old girl named Darcy. She was young, and she was not fully aware of the landscape she was entering. He had told her some things and not others, in the way that people disclose what they think they can disclose and conceal what they understand will not be tolerated. Darcy became his wife. She became the mother of his children. She became the person on the other side of the wall from the garage. He asked her to do housework naked, wearing only a pair of high heels, while he photographed her. She complied in the way that young wives in 1961 often complied with the requests of husbands they had married at 17 in a world that had not yet given them the full vocabulary for what compliance meant or did not mean. She did not understand that the request was not about her, had never been about her, that she was a prop in a fantasy that had been running since before she was born. The years of his marriage before the killings were not quiet years. They were years of increasing pressure, of a compulsion that he could suppress but not eliminate, that required more effort to suppress as the years passed, that expressed itself in ways that kept narrowly avoiding consequences. He continued stealing, panty raids on neighbors' houses. He was arrested once, found in the grounds of a women's dormitory at Oregon State University, wearing women's clothing, carrying stolen lingerie. The police who arrested him did not fully connect what they were seeing to anything beyond the obvious strangeness of it. He was charged with something minor. He was released. He had a medical excuse for the escalating behavior. He complained to his wife and to doctors of migraines, of blackouts, of a cycling instability that he framed as neurological. The migraines were probably real. The blackouts were almost certainly not, or not in the sense he described them, but they served a function. They provided a framework in which what was happening to him could be understood as illness rather than intention, as something being done to Jerry rather than something Jerry was doing. His wife was pregnant with their second child when his behavior crossed a threshold that it had been approaching for years. She was in the hospital giving birth, and for reasons that have never been fully explained, but that the people who studied Brudos have their theories about, the loss of control that a birth represents, the specific dynamic of Eileen's presence in his life, the pressure that had been building across years of inadequate suppression. He went out that night on one of the raids that had become his way of releasing pressure. He was not caught. He came home. His wife delivered their second child. And when she came home from the hospital with the baby, something in whatever internal mechanism had been holding things together broke down in a way it had not broken down before. He described experiencing, in the period that followed, the worst migraines and blackouts of his life. He described a cycling descent in which the compulsions became louder and more insistent, in which suppression required more energy than he had, in which the gap between what he wanted and what the ordinary surface of his life permitted him to have became wider and more intolerable with each passing week. The garage was where he spent his evenings. He had equipped it as a workshop. He had a pulley system on the ceiling, a practical arrangement for someone who worked on heavy equipment, or an arrangement that had been constructed with another purpose in mind. The garage had a lock. The garage was his. On January the 26th, 1968, a 19-year-old woman named Linda Slauson knocked on his door. Linda Slauson was working as a door-to-door encyclopedia saleswoman. This detail is almost impossibly mundane. A young woman doing a job that thousands of young women did in 1968, knocking on suburban doors in the early evenings, making her pitch, moving on to the next address. She had confused his address with a neighbor's, a small navigational error of the kind that happens constantly in suburban streets, where the numbers are not always well marked. She knocked on the door of the wrong house. Jerry Brudos answered. He was 30 years old. He was large, physically imposing in a way that he understood, and that was part of the specific advantage he carried in every encounter that followed. He told Linda Slauson he was interested in encyclopedias. He invited her inside. His wife was upstairs with the children. He led Linda to the basement, under the pretense of looking at something, in the way that someone who has planned what comes next creates the physical conditions for it. In the basement, he knocked her unconscious. He strangled her. His wife was upstairs with the children. What happened in the basement in the hours that followed Linda Slauson's death is documented in the confessions that Brudos eventually gave to investigators. Confessions that the detectives who took them described as among the most disturbing material they had encountered in their careers. He violated her body. He dressed her in clothing from his collection. He photographed her. He engaged with what he had made of her in the specific and extended way of someone who has been waiting for this for a very long time and is in no hurry. At some point, he became aware that his wife might come looking for him. He put the body somewhere temporary. He went upstairs. He sat at the dinner table. His wife was upstairs with the children. He went back to the garage later. He had a decision to make about what to do with what remained of Linda Slauson, and he made it in the specific, methodical way of someone who is thinking practically rather than emotionally. He cut off her left foot. He put the foot in his freezer so that he could continue to use it, dressed in various shoes when he wanted to. Then he tied the rest of her body to a piece of machinery and dumped it in the Willamette River. Linda Slauson's body was never recovered. She was officially a missing person for years. The foot in the freezer was found eventually, when everything else was found. He went back to his life. This is the thing that requires the most sustained attention in the Brudos case. He went back to his life. He went to work as an electronics technician. He came home for dinner. He was in the house with his wife and his children. He talked to neighbors. He existed, visibly and unremarkably, in the middle of suburban Salem for the 15 months that followed Linda Slauson's death. And during those 15 months, he killed 3 more women. And at no point did the surface of his ordinary life crack in a way that anyone around him registered. His wife did not know. This is a statement that has been disputed and examined and argued about across the decades since, because the idea that a woman sharing a house with her husband does not know what is in her husband's garage, what is hanging from the ceiling hook, what the smell means, what the pulley is for, strains the imagination in ways that are uncomfortable. And yet the investigation and the subsequent trial concluded that Darcy Brudos did not know, or did not allow herself to know, which is perhaps not a completely different thing, but is legally and morally a distinct category. What she knew is that the garage was Jerry's, that the lock was always locked, that she did not go there. She had been told not to go there, and she had accepted that instruction and built her daily life around it, in the way that people build their lives around the specific things they have accepted without examination. The garage was not hers to enter, so she did not enter it. And in the garage, between January of 1968 and April of 1969, things accumulated. On November 26, 1968, Thanksgiving Day, a 23-year-old woman named Jan Whitney was driving on the interstate between Salem and Albany when her car broke down. She pulled over. She was stranded on the side of the road, which in 1968, before mobile phones, before the specific infrastructure of modern roadside assistance, meant waiting and hoping that someone stopped who could help. Someone stopped. Jerry Brudos pulled over. He was large and he was calm, and he offered assistance in the specific way of someone who has done this before and knows how it goes. He told Jan Whitney he would call for a tow truck. He told her to come with him to make the call. She went with him. He strangled her from behind with a leather strap while she sat in his car. He drove her body back to the garage. This time, he had better access to the ceiling pulley. He hung Jan Whitney's body from it. He dressed her in lingerie and high heels from his collection, and he took photographs from different angles over the following hours. This continued for 2 full days. 2 days in which Darcy Brudos cooked meals and put children to bed and lived her life in the house. And in the garage, her husband returned repeatedly to what he had made. Jan Whitney's car was found locked at a rest stop on the interstate. Her body was found months later, tied to a piece of railroad iron at the bottom of the Willamette River. By then, other things had happened. On March 27, 1969, a 19-year-old Oregon State University student named Karen Sprinker parked her car at a Salem department store parking garage. She was meeting her mother for lunch. She never made it to lunch. Jerry Brudos was waiting in the parking garage. He was dressed in women's clothing, a wig, women's outer garments, a disguise that in retrospect seems preposterous, but that in the specific context of a 1960s parking garage worked well enough. He approached Karen Sprinker with a gun. He forced her into his car. He brought her to the garage. What happened to Karen Sprinker in that garage is documented in Brudos's confessions and in the physical evidence recovered when the garage was eventually searched, and I will not reproduce the specific catalogue of it here, not because the details are not significant, but because the catalogue itself becomes the thing rather than the person. And Karen Sprinker was a person, an honor student, a young woman who was meeting her mother for lunch on a Thursday in March and did not come home. He kept her body in the garage for several days. During those several days, his family was in the house. During those several days, something happened that Brudos later described to investigators with the specific deadpan of a man recounting a narrow escape. A drunk driver crashed their car into the Brudos home. leaving a hole in the wall large enough to see inside. Police came to investigate the crash. They stood outside the house. They could, conceivably, have looked through the hole and seen what the garage contained. They did not look, or they looked and did not understand what they were seeing, or the timing was such that the garage was temporarily clear of what it usually held. Brudos told investigators, "That was close." He said it the way someone describes a near miss on the highway. The close call quality of it was, to him, primarily interesting as an anecdote. On April 23, 1969, a 22-year-old woman named Linda Salih was approached in a Salem shopping center parking lot. Brudos displayed a fake police badge. He told her she was under arrest. He put her in his car. He brought her to the garage. Linda Salih's death was different from the others in one specific way. She managed at some point to scratch Brudos with a hook, an involuntary reflex, or a deliberate act of resistance. It is unclear which. He had an injury on his hand afterward. The injury was small and he managed it, but it represented something the previous 3 killings had not. A mark left on him by a victim, a trace of what he was doing on his body. He disposed of Linda Salih's body in the Willamette, weighted with auto parts. Her body was recovered. The physical evidence she left on him, the scratch, the circumstances of her disappearance from a parking lot where witnesses had seen a man with a fake badge, was the beginning of the thread that would eventually be pulled. By this point, something had shifted in how Brudos was operating. The patience and opportunism of the earlier killings, the encyclopedia salesperson who knocked on the wrong door, the woman with the broken down car, had given way to something more active, more desperate. He was hunting more deliberately. He needed more. He began cold calling women's dormitories at Oregon State University in Corvallis, working from a phone book, calling random rooms. He would present himself as a medical researcher conducting a study. He would ask questions designed to assess whether the woman on the other end of the phone was the kind of person who might agree to meet a stranger for a survey. Most of them said no. Some of them said yes and then thought better of it. The specific predatory logic of the cold calling approach, fishing through a list until someone takes the bait, was the method of someone who understood that volume and patience would eventually produce a result. One of the women he called agreed to meet him. She agreed. And then something in her made her doubt the decision, and she told a friend where she was going, and the friend was troubled by it enough to mention it to someone else. And in the specific chain of social concern that follows, when a young woman in 1969 says she is meeting a strange man she talked to on the phone, the information eventually reached a police detective named Jim Stovall. Stovall had been investigating the disappearances of women in the Salem area for months. He had a list of missing women and a scattering of witness reports, and very little that connected any of it in a way that pointed toward a specific person. The information about the cold-calling man who was asking women to meet him landed in the middle of his investigation like a specific and legible signal. He began making calls to the dormitories himself. He spoke to women who had been called by this person. He assembled a description, and the description matched a large man that witnesses had seen in several of the relevant locations: parking garages, interstate rest stops, the areas adjacent to places where women had last been seen. The investigation triangulated toward Salem. It triangulated toward a neighborhood. It triangulated toward a man named Jerry Brudos. On May 25, 1969, detectives brought Jerry Brudos in for questioning. He came voluntarily. This is a detail worth noting. He was not arrested. He was not compelled. He was asked if he would come and talk to investigators about some things they were looking into, and he said yes. The confidence of a man who had been operating for 15 months without the surface breaking, who had managed the drunk driver and the cold calling and everything in between without consequence. was a confidence that had perhaps become untethered from reality. Or he understood that refusing was itself a signal, and that cooperating was the best available strategy, and that he was good enough at the surface to manage a conversation with detectives. He was not good enough. The interview lasted multiple sessions. Investigators were patient and methodical, working from the outside of what they knew toward the inside. They had the witness descriptions. They had the timing of the disappearances. They had the cold calling leads. They began to ask Brudos about specific times and places, and he began to explain himself in ways that produced inconsistencies, and the inconsistencies accumulated. At some point in the process, the exact moment is not precisely documented, but it is the moment everything changed. Brudos began to talk about what he had actually done, not in the way of someone who has been broken, in the way of someone who wanted to talk. The detectives who took the confession later described sitting across from Brudos as one of the most genuinely unsettling professional experiences of their careers, not because he was distressed or dramatic or incoherent, but because he was none of those things. He described what he had done with the specific enthusiasm of someone sharing something they have been wanting to share for a long time. He grew animated discussing the shoes. He described the garage arrangements in detail. He recounted the specifics of each victim in the organized, sequential way of someone who has been replaying the memories regularly and finds them vivid and pleasurable. He told them about the foot in the freezer. He told them about the resin casts he had made of body parts, which he used as paperweights on his workbench. He told them about the photographs, hundreds of them, documenting what the garage had contained across 15 months. The detectives listened. They noted. They came back the next day and listened more. Over 3 days of confession, Brudos provided what investigators later described as the most detailed voluntary account of serial murder they had ever received. He confessed to 4 murders. He described the disposal of the bodies. He led investigators to the places where the weighted remains had been put in the Willamette River, and 2 of the 4 bodies were recovered. Linda Slauson was never found. Her foot had been in the freezer. It was found in the garage with everything else. The garage, when investigators finally entered it, was the specific physical record of everything Brudos had told them, and things he had not thought to mention. The photographs were there, the visual documentation of what the garage had been used for, which provided evidence that went beyond anything the confessions alone could have established. The resin casts were on the workbench. The shoe collection was extensive. The pulley system was exactly as he had described. Darcy Brudos was questioned extensively. A neighbor claimed she had helped move a body. She was charged with aiding and abetting in Karen Sprinker's murder. She maintained her innocence throughout. The trial, in October of 1969, found her not guilty. Whether she truly did not know, or whether the specific architecture of not knowing that she had constructed around the garage was sufficient to constitute genuine ignorance, is a question that the legal system answered in one direction, and that subsequent observers have continued to argue about in another. What is not disputed is that she divorced Jerry Brudos after the trial. She moved, changed her name, and eventually obtained a court order preventing her children from visiting or writing to their father. She rebuilt her life in the specific way that people rebuild from things that should not have happened. Jerry Brudos was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for Whitney, Sprinker, and Sallee. He was not charged for Slauson because her body was never recovered, and a charge of murder requires a body. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The psychiatric evaluations found him legally sane. They found schizotypal personality disorder and a catalogue of fetishistic pathology, but they found him capable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions and capable of distinguishing between right and wrong. He changed his plea to guilty. On June 27, 1969, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms at Oregon State Penitentiary. He was 30 years old. Jerry Brudos spent 37 years in Oregon State Penitentiary. He was, by all accounts, a model prisoner, which is a phrase that covers a specific and limited territory, the territory of institutional compliance, of following the rules that the institution sets and performing the functions assigned to him. He maintained the prison's electrical systems and computer equipment. He was given responsibility for vending machines and cable television infrastructure. He was, in the narrow terms of what prisons measure, good at being in prison. He was not good at accepting what he had done in any meaningful sense. His conversations with investigators, researchers, and journalists over the decades of his imprisonment returned consistently to the same territory: the shoes, the photographs, the garage arrangements, with the same quality of invested attention that the original confession had shown. He was not tortured by it. He was not distant from it. He was, if anything, still present in it, in a way that the psychiatric community found clinically significant and that everyone else found deeply disturbing. He was attacked by fellow inmates multiple times over the decades. He was struck with a bucket of water. He was assaulted in ways that left marks. He never identified his attackers to prison authorities. There are interpretations of this that reflect a prison code of silence and interpretations that reflect the specific satisfaction of a man who understood that what was done to him was what was owed. He loved Darcy. This is a claim made in multiple accounts of the Brudos case, sourced from the man himself, that throughout his imprisonment he maintained his love for the woman he had married, the woman who had divorced him, the woman who had obtained a court order to keep his children from him, the woman who had spent her life after him rebuilding from something that he had made necessary. Whether this constitutes love in any recognizable form is a question that the word itself fails to resolve. He died of liver cancer on March 28, 2006, at the age of 67. He had been in Oregon State Penitentiary longer than any other prisoner in the state's history. Linda Slauson was 19 years old. She knocked on the wrong door on an evening in January 1968 and never came home. Her body was never found. She is officially listed as a homicide victim whose remains have not been recovered, which is the bureaucratic language for a family that waited and never got what they needed to fully close something. Jan Whitney was 23. She was driving home on Thanksgiving Day when her car broke down and a man stopped to help her. Karen Sprinker was 19, an honor student, meeting her mother for lunch on a Thursday in March. Linda Sallee was 22. She was approached in a parking lot by a man with a fake badge. 4 women, a garage in Salem, Oregon, a wife in the house who did not go into the garage, children who grew up in the same building where the worst things in this story happened. The specific horror of the Brudos case is not its scale. 4 victims is not the largest number in the catalogue of American serial murder. It is not its duration. 15 months is not the longest span. It is the domesticity of it, the impossibility of the image, a family dinner, children's voices, ordinary evening light, and 15 feet away, through the wall, behind the padlock, the thing that was in the garage, the surface held for 15 months. The surface that held it was indistinguishable to everyone around it from the surface of any ordinary life. That is the lesson of Jerry Brudos that does not have a comfortable resolution. Not that evil looks different from ordinary life, that it does not, that it can live in the next room, behind a locked door, while children sleep and dinner is on the table, and the neighbors wave from their driveways and nothing looks wrong. Nothing looked wrong. The garage told a different story, but nobody opened the garage. Jerry Brudos was one of 6 killers whose crimes contributed to the psychological profile that Thomas Harris used when creating Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, alongside Ed Gein, Ted Bundy, Edmund Kemper, Gary Heidnik, and Gary Ridgway. The profile that emerges from those 6, the specific combination of fetishistic pathology and domestic concealment and the particular violation of victims that their crimes represented, is the profile that the novel and the film attempted to make comprehensible as fiction. What fiction cannot fully do with that material is convey the specific geography of it. The junkyard shoes, the mother's reaction, the locked garage door in a suburban driveway, the ceiling pulley, the wife in the next room, the left foot of a 19-year-old woman dressed in a high-heeled shoe in a family freezer. That is not the territory of fiction. That is the territory of what actually happened in Salem, Oregon, while everything on the surface looked exactly as it was supposed to look. And somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, in the Willamette River and its tributaries, Linda Slauson is still there. She knocked on the wrong door. She never got to knock on another one.